Welcome, everybody, to Broadcast Team Alpha, where we bring you cutting edge conversation while exploring the quantum possibilities. And you know, we're going to do it again tonight. But speaking of quantum possibilities, I read something recently that said if you subscribe wholly to the quantum, that you disregard spirituality. And I thought about that. I thought about that for like 10 days now. And my answer to that is I have quantum faith. So we have somebody tonight who can really talk to us about subjects like this and other subjects. But before Augie tells you about our returning guest, we love having him. I just want to invite you how to connect with us. If you don't know, you can connect with us at broadcastteamalpha.com. You can come join us on Sunday afternoon, 2 p.m. Eastern, for the Mastermind Connection. You can send an email to themastermindconnection@gmail.com. Augie will send you the link and you can come hang out with us, where a bunch of really cool people with amazing minds and, even more importantly, beautiful hearts come together and we agree on a visualization. And it's always for humanitarian purposes or benevolent purposes. And we focus on that particular topic and we imagine it going up into the quantum, where it becomes made manifest in our reality. So if you'd like to join us, it's a beautiful guided meditation. It's a tiny bit hypnotherapy-ish, right? Little disclaimer. Not hypnotherapy though. And it's just a beautiful journey. The worst that could happen is that you felt like you had a really good nap when you come out of it. So Augie, will you tell us about our guest Paul tonight, please?
Yeah, I can't wait. Here we go. We have Paul Willis returning to Broadcast Team Alpha. And I tell you, this is going to be so interesting because he's going to talk about some changes that is just about to happen. But first, a few things about him. He's a world traveler, a researcher and digger into old records hardly anybody ever gets to see or hear about. And he is an international best-selling author, and his and his books, they probe into ancient human history and mythologies that once you start unfolding it, it appears to be actually true, even though we call it mythology. So there's a lot to that. He is also a sought-after speaker, and he makes video documentaries that is seen by the millions, and he also serves as an archdeacon at an Anglican church in Australia. And he has many written titles on Christian mysticism and spirituality. And one of his books is called Escaping from Eden, and another one is The Scars of Eden. And now he's coming out with another one, The Echoes of Eden, that is going to unfold a lot of new good truth that dates back millennia. That's going to be good. It's going to be available shortly, and I wanted to talk to you about that. And beyond that, I watched a video on YouTube that he had done not too awful long ago. The title was, wait for it, was Jesus an alien? And you need to go find that video, because I wanted to talk a little bit about this, because even I have written about this and many others have written about this, but he pulls it together with sources from all the written records that really points in that direction. But before we get to that part of it, we're going to talk about what NASA is doing. There is a plan for us that is coming to unfold itself shortly. And of course, I'm using shortly, well, tongue in cheek here. We don't know any dates or anything, but there is some things afoot. And he has a little bit of an extra information on that we really love to hear about. So without any more, welcome to the show, Paul.
Welcome.
G'day, Agi. G'day, Nori. Thank you so much for having me on your show again.
So good to have you here. So good. How's
Yes.
it going, Paul?
It's a full year this year for sure. As you mentioned, Agi, just now, I'm coming to the copy editing stage of Echoes of Eden, which will be available for pre-order hopefully in the next month or so. So all that's happening, that's filling in all the gaps. I'm interviewing some really interesting people for the Fifth Kind TV in the next few weeks. Tomorrow I'm talking to Whitley Strieber, which will be a fascinating conversation. All that's happening, things happening with the Paul Willis channel as well on YouTube, and a few other projects in the pipeline besides. Audio versions of Escaping from Eden and The Scars of Eden, that's also for this year. So I think I'll have done 2 or 3 years work by the time we get to Christmas.
Wow. Are you warping time?
Well, it's filling in every gap at the moment, but it's all work that I enjoy. So it's more than a pleasure to be doing it.
That's so great.
It's working for a living, doesn't it?
That's right.
Guys. So let's just talk about NASA for a minute, since that was, our draw, for tonight's show. And Augie and I, have differing views of what it really means. Tell us about it, and maybe Augie and I will change our views of it, but can you tell us more about it, and how do you know that?
Well, the flow of information from NASA to the public is a really interesting topic. And I know a lot of people with interests like ours get very exasperated with NASA because they feel NASA knows more than it's saying. And I've emailed them questions and they've never given me a straight answer. And I hear a lot like that. And then I hear others who are a little bit more forgiving, who say, well, NASA is fulfilling its mission. Its mission is not as a news agency. It is pursuing a very particular mission, and, all grace to them. But there are some really interesting things going on in the conversations within the NASA community, which probably everyone who's part of this conversation today would love to know more about. In my research for Echoes of Eden, I discovered, for instance, that 30 years ago, NASA was already very actively involved in working out if they could fly a craft through a wormhole. They have, since that time, flown around wormholes and measured them, and measured how much mass is traveling through them, one in particular from the Earth's surface to the sun. But how much have you or I heard about that? How much of that has reached the mainstream? From time to time, you might see a little something come up in your news feed saying, oh, they're looking at electromagnetic wormholes. But no, there's 30 years of empirical data about how they function and how much can go in and how much comes out and what you can fly through them and what you can't. But that's not public information. Now, if you ask a very focused question, you might get a very focused answer. And that's very often how it works. You need to know what questions to ask. But something that really raised people's eyebrows just before Christmas was a little story in the news about NASA hiring theologians. And people immediately thought, what? Wait, this is obviously prepping the public for some big announcement, and they've asked the theologians to help them word something up. That was sort of how the story ran. I first saw it in the Daily Star, and I shared it on my feed, and people said, oh, you can't believe a word from the Daily Star. Well, actually, their sources were very solid. And it was in the Times and other very reputable journals, but there had been a little bit of Chinese whispers, because by the time you or I were reading that story, we had the image of this secret department within NASA behind closed doors with a bunch of theologians around the table trying to script up the announcement that we're in contact or whatever it might be. And having done a little bit of digging, it turns out that's not really the case. Of course, NASA always has information that is not on its website, and that is not part of its press statements. That's, of course, that's the case. And in terms of what can be communicated and how and when, yes, there'll be other players involved. And yes, they'll be very interested in what people might perceive as the theological implications of what they're being told. Now, they're not the only organization to sit down and think about what would be the social implications or the theological implications of this kind of statement. The Pentagon has done it, government has done it, the Roman Catholic Church has done it, the Royal Society has done it. So of course NASA has done it. And of course it consults with theologians as part of its thinking. And that's closer to the reality of what's going on, that they do have theologians that they consult. And yes, some of it may be to do with how they communicate, but that assumes that there is something to communicate. And we've seen a real acceleration in the last 5 years of what you might call soft disclosure, where you have statements being made by people very close to authority and official positions. So, for instance, we've heard from the late Paul Hellyer, the former Minister of Defense for Canada. We've heard from Alain Juillet, the former Chief of French Intelligence, from Haim Eshed, the former Chief of Space Security for Israel, from Chris Mellon, the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush. And they come out and they make statements about us being in contact, about us having materials retrieved from UFO crashes that are being examined, about us having 70 decades worth of material data on those topics. Not just the analysis of materials, but the analysis of what's called human interface, which is the effect on human beings of close encounters. So all this gets spoken, and then the official channels, the official authorities don't debunk it. And that's what's new, because in the previous chapter, people might come out and then NASA would come out and say, Ed Mitchell is a great American, but we do not share his views, or a statement like that. Well, that's not happening anymore. So it's been up to gear on what's being talked about, what's been out in the press. There's been such an acceleration that I think it's not difficult to see that there have to be steps taken by authorities to prepare for the moment when a lot of people join the dots, or something happens that makes it blindingly obvious that we're already in contact. There has to be that bit of prep, so that if they find themselves in a situation where they have to make an official statement, we are in contact, we have been for decades, then you've got 70% of the public saying, yes, I'd more or less piece that picture together. Right. And so I think these stories about theologians working with NASA, being released, not being debunked, is all a part of that preparation. I think that more of that is happening, not because of a change of philosophy at a government level. I think that the non-disclosure agreement among our visitors is not as watertight as it's been in the past. And there's been some intensification of what's happening at that level that's reflected in stories like these at the human level.
Do you think it's to prevent having to do like a massive debriefing? You know,
yes.
if everybody loses their mind, is that a little bit of prevention that way?
Yes, I think it is. I think
Yeah.
it is. I don't think they ever want to make a big official statement. But if they have to, it has to be after the point where people have bit by bit put that picture together, so that there isn't that immediate, not so much panic, but anger about information being withheld, because I think that's the harder thing to manage. How would people suddenly feel about their governments if they realized that their governments had been in possession of life-changing information for generations and had chosen not to tell us? Well, immediately people would say, in whose interests have
Right.
these secrets been kept? And I think that's what's politically so difficult about the big statement. And so, yes, I think they would far rather have 24,000 drip drips than that big moment at the microphone.
Yeah,
There
exactly.
may be another reason also, because we know that religion, organized religion specifically, they have an enormous power on society. And I remember a few years ago, probably about 3 years or so, the Speaker of the European Union on the floor, he made a statement and he said that we have been in contact with people from other worlds and we have had some advice, but they are worried about us. Now, that was as close to disclosure as you can get, but it all drained in the sand because the religious community in Europe got right on top of him and they buried it. So they don't want to have disclosure before they are ready for it, to explain it to their flock, so to speak, that, yeah, they're here, but they're the good guys and we're working with them, or something to that effect. I think there's got to be a controlled scenario that they don't have in their hands yet. Could that be something?
Well, it's funny because in 2009, we had the Pontifical Academy of Sciences convening its colloquium to discuss the theological implications of contact with other civilizations. And spokespeople for Pope Benedict XVI met the press with some very interesting statements to the effect that we shouldn't be surprised if we encounter other civilizations. We shouldn't be surprised because they're in the Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and we should regard them as part of our wider cosmic family. And so the people we heard this from were Jose Gabriel Funes, the director of the Vatican Observatory, its senior astronomer, Guy Consolmagno, Monsignor Guy Consolmagno, and then from Monsignor Corrado Balducci, who was the Vatican's chief advisor in the paranormal. They all made statements like these to prepare the faithful, as if to say, when contact becomes obvious, don't you remember we already talked about this? And we said there's nothing to worry about. We're just meeting more of our cosmic family. And it looked like they'd made these statements to be ready in case another authority made a revelation, or in case something happened that made it obvious. However, nothing happened after that. There was no follow-on. And in fact, if you go on the net and try and find some of these statements today, well, a lot of them have vanished. They were there when I was researching Escaping from Eden, and I managed to quote these people word for word. You try and find that online now, it's disappeared. So to me, that looked like they were readying themselves to prepare the faithful for contact and say, this is all part of our great narrative. It doesn't blow our story out of the water. And then no disclosure came and they dialed everything back. So it shows they can do it if they feel it's necessary. They feel they can accommodate ET contact within the frame of their doctrines, but only if they have to. That's how it seems to roll.
Very interesting.
So it's a need to know basis. But as soon as that happened, you had to come away thinking, all right, well, they know something I don't know for sure.
Yeah, for sure. When's the other shoe gonna drop, right?
Yes, that's right. And in fact, you can approach this from so many angles, but if you just follow the story of colonial conquests through history, with every colonial conquest, there's a control of information that would have included the sequestration of local information and local knowledge for papal libraries, royal libraries. So just a study of history tells you that those with the keys to those libraries know things that you and I don't know, unless we're able to piece them together from the esoteric and indigenous sources that have maintained them underground, so to speak.
But you mentioned also that if you ask specific questions, you may get a specific answer. And I think there's a lot to that. For people listening to this, write to NASA, ask them specific questions, and you just might get something. Because I've been, a couple of decades ago, I was digging around in NASA archives a lot for pictures. And I knew the plate numbers of the pictures that I wanted. And I wrote to them with that specific question, and I may have to request it twice in order for me to get it. But I got pictures of huge cigar-shaped craft laying on the surface of the moon, crashed. It was obviously it was a cigar-shaped craft, and another one flying over the surface as it looks like a pencil, throwing a shadow on the ground, and buildings up there. I got the pictures from them. If you ask them specific questions like that. So there is an openness in some areas.
There is. That's absolutely right. And I'm glad you said that, because NASA is a community of people, for a start. It's not a monolithic thing. And so you might get different responses from different people. They're all bound by layers of official secrets laws, but then there are other laws as well that mean you can get a result like you did, Arge, where you ask a very specific question and you will get that answer. But if you write and say, when are you going to come clean about the fact we've been in contact, well, what kind of reply do you expect to get from that?
Yeah, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen.
Oh, man. But
So
NASA is such an interesting organization that's got so many different facets to it. They have large operations about things here on Earth that does not involve space.
Oh, yes, that's right. That's right. I mean, that's a very interesting white rabbit to follow. If you just look up what are the terrestrial interests of NASA, and then ask the question, how does that connect with the exploration of space? A very interesting picture begins to emerge. And it connects with, have you ever wondered why NASA uses so many names for their projects from out of Greek, Egyptian, Sumerian mythology? Why would they be interested in mythology? Again, join those dots and a coherent picture begins to emerge. And you do hear people from out of NASA speak on those topics from time to time. Why would they be interested in that, you have to ask?
Maybe they found them to be true.
Certainly found them to be relevant.
Yep.
At the very least.
Mm-hmm.
At the very least. Somebody in the chat room asked, and I don't know if you have knowledge of this, but how would NASA reach out to theologians? I mean, do they call them, or do they send them an email, or?
Yes, well, I'm sure they do. They haven't sent me an email or called me, so I can't give you the details, but it's not too difficult to find who are the theologians whose work has come close to this area. Let's see if they'd be interested in a conversation. And they've got at least 24 emails and phone numbers on their lists in terms of people they're working with at present. But again, it's not like there's a covert unit. It's that they're in conversation. They're interested in people's input and expertise. From time to time, you might be invited for a conversation or even to give a lecture to a group of staff who have a particular interest that they're pursuing. So they really are, they're not in a bubble. they are part of defense and they're part of the wider community of the world. And so there are lots of very interesting conversations going on.
I can only
I think
imagine.
though that, yeah, I'm probably a little more conspiratorial than the average bear out there. And I would say that NASA knows there will be a day when they have to disclose some of these things. And in preparation from that, they want to also protect the Christian or the religious community. So they are consulting with the ministers in order to, when and how this comes about, how would you suggest that we phrase things to protect you? I know there's a cooperation that I'm not just suspicion of that. I know that is. There's a cooperation between here that they try to protect the status quo at every level of society.
Well, that's right. And I think that's just the more detailed way of saying they want to know how best to communicate their information. You know, a huge proportion of the world's population have some kind of a faith in some kind of God. So you have to stop and think, who's our audience before you go out and make your statement? And so their conversations with theologians are absolutely a part of that calculation.
Mm-hmm. The question is the $64 trillion question. You know, the price has gone up now.
Yes,
so
it has.
The $64 trillion question is when?
Well, as I say, I think the when might not be in the control of our governments and covert government. I think we are reactive to what's going on in the community of our visitors and oversighters. Haim Eshed spoke about an intergalactic federation of ET demographics who feel they have a stakeholding in Project Earth. They are the ones who make the policies of disclosure, non-disclosure, and what may or may not be happening in terms of interference on the planet's surface. And I think they set the speed of things. Haim Eshed, this is the Brigadier General who ran space security for Israel for 27 years, said that the consensus on that body is that they need to wait until human beings have, quote, a better understanding of space, unquote. So that's rather interesting because it wasn't a better understanding of ET Company. It's actually bigger than that. Better understanding of what the universe is, of what space is. And when we're more up to speed on that, then maybe we'll be having a more open conversation. So that's all rather interesting. And you can see why thinking would have to really deepen to move things forwards, why you might need to talk to philosophers and theologians, as well as politicians and media people, to move all that forward.
Right, right. So it would be like looking through a microscope to say, how are we going to soften the blow of people finding out, you know, that about their galactic family? Instead of having that microscopic view, we need to start backing up, like you said, and then get, you know, some kind of a better understanding of really what's going on. Really.
Yes, yes, that's right. That's exactly right. I take my hat off to the artists who are part of this process, because I do believe that what happens in literature and in film law is every bit as much part of the process of disclosure as statements like those from Haim Eshed. You've only got to look at what's happened in the Marvel universe in the last 10 years to realize that there is a very deliberate, careful, and finessed process of what I would call disclosure happening in those movies that are taking a step back, that are asking the question, well, where do you think intelligence came from? Where do you think consciousness came from? Where do you think life-supporting planets came from? and getting us thinking on a much bigger canvas than we have before. The Marvel movies today are nothing like the Marvel stories of 50 years ago. And you've only got to watch a couple to realize that producers, directors, writers are having very deep conversations about what they think the public should be thinking about as they put these movies out. I was blown away just the other day. I watched The Eternals with my young kids, and I had to keep stopping the video and saying, "That's in my book. That's in my book." And eventually I had to leave the room so they could watch the movie uninterrupted.
Dad,
And there's
Dad.
we know, Dad, we know. There's so much of that kind going on as well. And I think that has to do with some of our company wanting to nudge the conversation forwards. And that's why our creatives are getting that impulse, getting that nudge. Some of them are very well versed in the ancestral narratives of the world and world mythology, but there is a little bit of channeling that goes on in the creative process, I believe, that adds a little spark to all of this. I think that's a very significant part of the journey that we're on, of understanding space more fully and being ready for information about our cosmic company.
That's such a good point. And maybe not our cosmic company, but I found it so intriguing that the new Matrix introduced AI in a way. I mean, they had this, AI being that was one of their allies, and you fell in love with it like you would a puppy, like it was just so lovable and so, human-ish, and so for the cause and part of the family. I was like, isn't that interesting right there?
It is interesting, isn't it? Because AI, I mean, when was the first Matrix movie? 1999. AI was this sort of mechanical threat in that first movie. And now we're on to this. AI is our friend who we love. Absolutely. Which is probably rather truer to how we move into the world of the Matrix.
It expands on itself. Now, see, we are about at the bottom of the hour here, and we have an announcement, Nori, about a new show that we or you are starting. I'm just going to ride back seat with you. Would you say something?
Yes. So we're opening up a new stream to Broadcast Team Alpha. We're going to continue doing everything that we're doing, like tonight with the amazing Paul Wallace. But now we're going to expand it a little bit more, because my thing is all about the human being and, the spirit and the soul that's inside of you. So we're going to be moving into health and life and lifestyle, and how all of that impacts us, and some of the new trends and things that are coming, up that can make, this part of our journey, a little bit better and a little bit nicer and, a whole lot healthier for us. So that's going to come up in March. We were going to launch it Friday, but it was just a little bit too soon. So, Mac, do you have the promo that you're going to show?
I'd like to watch, so I will note that down and take a look.
Oh, Mac. Okay. He played it.
It's done.
We're back.
We're back.
We just couldn't see it, so that's okay.
We're warping time. I don't know. I think we're warping time. So I did watch your video also, Paul, on talking about Jesus and ET. And I love what you did with the books of the Bible in the beginning of that. That was, am I talking about the correct video?
I think so. I have a couple that talk about the books of the Bible.
That was so enlightening for me. I love that. But, Augie is like a little kid, at Christmas with this conversation. So can we open up the conversation about Jesus and maybe Jesus being part of our galactic family?
I would love to see that.
Well, when I stumbled into the world of paleocontact, it was through Bible translation and getting to the root meanings of some of the key words in the ancient texts. And the moment you realize that some of the earliest God stories of the Bible are probably not God stories, they're the memories of paleocontact, which have been translated in later centuries into monotheistic stories of God. And I'm not saying anything controversial there. There's a very broad scholarly consensus that that's what happened. In the 6th century BCE, stories that had too many gods in them were edited to teach the monotheism of Judaism. So when you reframe those stories, you then have to go back and say, well, what's the implications for Jesus? Did Jesus know this? Where does he fit within this story?
Yes.
And I rediscovered Plato along the way, because when I concluded that what those early stories of the Bible really teach is that our ancestors were genetically modified by ET visitors, I discovered I wasn't the first person to have that thought, and that Plato had actually taught that 2,500 years ago, and that some of the very early church fathers agreed with every word Plato said. So again, I had to stop and think, well, what are the implications for Jesus? Plato has this wonderful cosmic view. We were talking about taking a step back to understand the universe better. Well, Plato does that in the most phenomenal way. And he said, in the beginning was consciousness. Before the material universe was consciousness. To put modern language on it, a unified field of consciousness, which then fractalized into the material realm so that that consciousness could experience and experience itself. You and I are part of that process. So before we were material beings, we were beings of consciousness. Before we were individual beings of consciousness, we were source consciousness. So Plato argues for that one step at a time on a logical basis. We're now here having this material experience to learn something, and then we return to cosmic consciousness enriched by the journey. So it's like the great hero's journey from community to the adventure, back to community enriched. That's Plato's story for the whole cosmos, and he sees our individual stories as aspects of that. Well, as soon as I read that and understood that, I realized that's exactly how the Gospels present the story of Jesus, the Gospel of John in particular. So the Gospel of John begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Then the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and has this human experience and has this adventure, addresses the challenge of, can we do consciousness, intelligence, and love as separate entities exercising free choice? That's really what he's demonstrating. And then towards the end of the gospel, Jesus is praying to the source, who he addresses as Father, and says, and now, Father, I'm returning to you, back to the glory we enjoyed before the foundation of the world. So I read that afresh and realized that Jesus's story is part of the hero's journey as Plato maps it out. And it highlights all those occasions when Jesus says he is a model for all of us. Anyone who believes in me would do the kinds of things I've been doing. I have given you this as an example, he says. So suddenly I'm thinking, all right, this is who he is. And so maybe what's really important about Jesus is not his uniqueness, but his sameness, that he's the same as us, showing what is possible in this material realm for a fully conscious human being. So that had my attention. Uniqueness question mark? Well, it got another question mark as I reread the Bible and realized that the story of his conception and birth, which Christianity is often told as this totally unique experience on the part of Mary as mother and Jesus, turns out not to be unique. In fact, Mary's cousin Elizabeth had the same experience, a close encounter with an entity called an angel, but we have to drill down to work out what that means, and then she's pregnant. Mary, close encounter with an angel, then she's pregnant. Samson's mum, close encounter, pregnant. And they seem to be retellings of a very ancient story in the stories of beginnings of the Bible, and that's the story of Abraham and Sarah, who have a close encounter with three, what the Sumerians called sky people. And after that, Sarah is pregnant. Now, that gives a bigger context for the conception story of Jesus. He's one of 4 stories in the Bible of close encounters followed by an anomalous pregnancy. And stories like that are not the exclusive preserve of the Bible. Lao Tzu's mum told the same story. The mother of Vipassana Buddha, the 22nd incarnation of Buddha before Siddhartha Gautama, told the same story. The mother of the Yellow Emperor told the same story. All very intelligent, conscious, enlightened people. What's very, very curious about these parallels is that when you go to the Eastern tellings of the story, very often the mothers were very specific that they had an experience with a beam of light coming down to them from out of the sky, and then they were pregnant. I was blown away when I saw a painting from Carlo Crivelli, and I'm trying to remember the year he painted it. What was it, 14 something. Carlo Crivelli paints a picture of the moment when Mary is impregnated. Oh my goodness, you think, what on earth has he drawn? What he's drawn is a beam of light shining down on her from out of the sky from what clearly looks like a flying saucer up in the sky. Where would he get that idea from? That's not in the Bible. That's not how it's told in the texts. But it's exactly how Lao Tzu's mum described what happened to her before she became pregnant. So there's an artist in the Renaissance period who knows that these stories are all connected, who knows that there is this body of stories of star children, of which the narrative of Jesus is just one part. And by star children, what we mean is people just like you and me, but with a little bit more ET in them than the rest of us. Our ancestors said we all have a bit of ET in us. We're all hybrids. We're all part of a wider cosmic family, but there's just some little fine tuning that's happened with these guys that means they have this, they're more attuned. They have this greater consciousness, this greater intelligence, greater awareness of who they are. And because of that, they leave behind this indelible imprint that signals to us what is possible for you and me as human beings on planet Earth.
Another thing that I had discovered after I wrote my book that covers this, and I discovered lately, is that in the old Aramaic language, the word virgin is synonymous with unmarried woman.
Yes, that's right. The history of that word is really intriguing because when Luke, and it's Luke who tells the story, it's only in Luke, it's not in the other Gospels. When Luke tells the story of the virgin birth, that's the name of the doctrine, he appeals to a particular verse from out of the Hebrew canon. Behold, a virgin shall be with child. Now, in the Hebrew text, the word just means young girl or unmarried girl. Then you get to the 2nd century BCE, and you've got the writing of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew canon. And it was from the Septuagint that Jesus and the apostle quoted when they gave their teachings, wrote their writings. It's in the Greek that the translators decided this means virgin. This means not just someone who's not married, it means someone who's not had sex. So that's where that word comes from. And then Luke builds a whole doctrine on it. But as I've just said, how significant is that when the story of Mary runs in parallel with Elizabeth, runs in parallel with Samson's mum, runs in parallel with Sarah, and when you realize that Abraham and Sarah are the Hebrew version of Brahma and Saraswati from the Vedic tradition, if you can accept that we've got recollections of the same couple, then we're actually looking at a couple who are as primordial to humanity as Adam and Eve, because Brahma and Saraswati are the progenitors of the human race. Go back and read the Hebrew again when it says that Abraham means the father of the many nations, and you think, how did I miss that?
Yeah.
This is another story of beginnings. Abraham was the father of the many nations. And this sudden leap forward where we've now got the human race follows an ET intervention, just like Plato said, just like we hear from other ancestral narratives all around the world.
It's a whole lot of light beam pregnancies going on.
Yeah, that's right. And because of the way the Bible's put together, we think Abraham and Sarah are much later in the story. They're in the world as we know it. But my research shows no, what you've got is side by side a whole number of stories of beginnings. And the story of Abraham and Sarah is a story of beginnings.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Woo!
Man, I can just imagine that in the year 325 and 326, when they met in Constantinople or Nicaea, they screwed up a lot of things.
Well, the story of Christianity's narrowing down to the orthodoxy that we're familiar with today is a long story. Nicaea played a part in it, and Nicaea's big agenda was really to get the language right in describing Jesus. How was he human? How was he divine? But getting rid of the ET aspect, the interdimensional aspect, the previous lives aspect, the contact aspects of primitive Christianity, that began much earlier. And really by the mid-100s, decisions were being made to either excise those elements or ignore them. And so the Gnostic texts became excised, and then texts within the Bible that imply all those things simply got ignored and were never preached on. So you can still find them, you can still ask your pastor about them, but they won't be part of your church's doctrinal basis.
Right.
They're for you and me to join the dots.
Mm-hmm.
I love
You know,
putting together with you. I'm sorry.
Plato and Socrates, they were very wise people, but you sent us your book there, and I went through it, and I found something in there that was kind of interesting, and that is that Socrates, and I think I can quote something saying to the fact that Plato and Socrates took the mysterious mountaintop brew. Could you expand on that a little bit? Was that more like maybe I don't know. Please go with that, because
well, there's a lot more contact ET contact, interdimensional contact in our ancient texts than we tend to remember. And it's certainly the case for Plato / Socrates. And you really always have to say them together, because Socrates didn't write his own books. Plato wrote for him as part of the following generation who had been taught by Socrates. And he speaks about the Eleusinian mysteries as one of his sources of information. So Plato puts all this on the lips of Socrates, but it's Plato's book. And the story is told with such interior detail that I think he's describing experiences he had had himself. Whichever it is, either Socrates or the both of them participated in the Eleusinian mysteries and got information from them. Now, Plato says he's got a number of sources of information. And the first, and his big thing, is what he called philosophy. We might call it science, the application of logic to things we can all observe. Then another source that he names is information from a previous civilization. And he specifies it's the Atlantean civilization. Information from there went to the ancient Egyptian priesthood. That was curated by an esoteric society of the descendants of that priesthood. That information was passed on to the Greek legislator Solon, a real historical figure. And then Solon's grandson, I think it was a peer of Plato in the class of Socrates. So he says some of the information has come from there, specifically information about previous civilizations, planetary cataclysms, and what our planet looks like from a distance from space. All rather interesting, and he gets it, he nails it. Then there's another source of information, the Eleusinian mysteries. And what this was a tea ceremony. The tea was called kykeon, and it was a blend of leaves and fungus that was then fermented and ingested in order to trigger an altered state of consciousness, a near-death experience in which the initiate would have conversations with entities from another dimension that they would not normally be able to see and hear. This is all in Plato. I can't believe I missed this when I studied Plato for my theology, but this is what he says happens. And he says the entities you get into conversation with may be the same ones you get into conversation with when you die, because it is a near-death experience that's triggered. And the conversations that Plato / Socrates had were along the lines of, why are you letting fear ruin your life? You know, by giving fear leverage in your life, you can be manipulated, and you're so limited in your choices and the way you live your life. Why are you doing that? In fact, there's all these heavier emotions that are spoiling your human experience. Resentment, unforgiveness, rage, ambition. Why are you doing that? You're more intelligent than that. So shake all that stuff off and live a bit more intelligently, according to who you really are as a being of consciousness. That was the very thumbnail form of the tough love counseling session that Plato / Socrates had. Well, when I read that, I thought, this is indistinguishable from what happened to my friend Jason when he did a tea ceremony in another part of the world in another century. And seeing the parallels and hearing those themes made me take seriously these claims. I think it's kind of a countercultural moment when you're reading Plato and he's got all this closely reasoned stuff, and then he says, and then there's this information I got from an altered state of consciousness, and you're expected just to run with that. It's not countercultural the moment you start informing yourself about how indigenous peoples all around the world have curated their knowledge and what they do about it. And one of the things I look at in Echoes of Eden, coming out soon, is to realize that the healing modalities of many indigenous peoples are contact modalities. If you front up to a Navajo healer or a Sangoma or a Nanga from Southern Africa because you need healing, what they will do is they will try and establish contact with the cloud of witnesses that's accompanied you to that meeting. And they will expect your spirits to communicate with their spirits what's wrong and how we can address it. And they will create an environment in which they can pick up on that communication, spirit to spirit communication. And often what they do to tune into that, as if they were a radio tuning into radio waves, is either create something that can be influenced by that field, so a fire, a smoke, or they will trigger an altered state of consciousness that means they can actually hear what's going on. And that's all around the world.
Wow.
You know, Southern Africa, the Nangas and Sangomas did not learn it from Navajo guardians or vice versa. This is what their ancient contact taught them.
Amazing.
And when I see that in Southern Africa, I see that in Navajo America, hear that from Plato, and then go back to the Bible, I realize it's all there in the Bible as well, just neglected.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
You mentioned intermittent planetary cataclysm, I think you called it. I remember reading also that this is something that they said happened every few thousand years and caused by objects coming from space.
Yes, that's exactly what Plato said. Every few thousand years. His estimate was every 5,000 years. If that's true, then we're long overdue a planetary reset. Either that, or we've got more friends in the picture now to slow that process down. But that was what he said. And he said he got that information via Solon's grandson, via Solon, via the ancient Egyptian priesthood, via the survivors of the Atlantean civilization, who should know, because that civilization was ended in exactly that way, according to Plato. And we hear echoes of that in other stories. You go to Greek narratives, and the story of a flood that resets civilization on planet Earth is all there. It's there in the Bible as well, of course. So there are a lot of dots to be joined.
Every society have that stories.
Sorry. Paul, Eleusinian mystery, how do you spell that?
Yes, Eleusinian. So it's Eleusinian. Eleusinian mysteries. They were performed in a beautiful retreat center on the top of a hill overlooking Athens. You can still go and visit the remains of that complex, and you realize that the equivalent of millions of dollars had been spent on creating that center as a place to curate this experience, this interdimensional experience. Wow. And the moment you realize there was a lot of money invested into doing that, you realize that this was a very valued and long-standing tradition already 2,500 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So I have a little bit of a different question, and hopefully we can continue the conversation maybe when the new show begins. What do you think we need to do, humanity needs to do, in order to become more conscious? You know, people are like, don't eat meat and don't stand on your head on Friday, whatever. What do you really think? Where does it begin? Where does it begin?
Well, that's a great question. The earliest stories of paleo contact among many indigenous peoples on planet Earth are stories of ET visitors sitting down with our ancestors and introducing them to the native plant life and saying, this is good to eat. This is good to avoid. this is good for your health. And so I think there's a lot of information to do with agriculture and diet that helped our ancestors make a great leap forward. And when people start studying consciousness, it's not very long before they are beginning to alter how and what they eat. There's a definite connection there. So people clean up what they eat. I talk about my Navajo friend, the guardian of the Navajo tradition. In my book, he's called Troy, not his real name, changed to protect the innocent. But Troy's story is that when he was 13 years old, he came home from school one day, and I'm sure he was just in the mood to chill and bludge and have a rest after a hot day and hard day at school. Unfortunately, when he gets home, it's clear his mum and dad have got guests. There's this black car parked outside the house. So he goes into the living room, and his mum and dad are there, and his grandfather is there, looking very stern and emotional. And then there are two strangers in the room, and his mum beckons him over, and he says, "Troy, you're a good boy. You remember everything we told you." And while this is happening, he realizes that his backpack, his boots are in the far corner of the room, packed. You go with these men now. And within 24 hours, he's in a totally unfamiliar part of the world with a number of other 13-year-old boys, with these two stern men saying, "You're going to need to find water, shelter. Better start with water. We'll see how you go." And then they disappear. And they're left thinking, when are they coming back? Are they coming back? Hours, days, months? And it was the beginning of a months-long initiation process, just the first episode of over the next few years. And so the very beginning of his preparation to become a shaman was a radical change in his diet, and learning to eat what was there in the environment, not what he'd bought from a shop, from a factory, so on and so forth. So yeah, changing our diet, drinking clean water is very much a part of it. I was talking to a friend from Guinea who had met a 117-year-old man.
Wow.
And asked the question we would all ask: how do I get to 117? What's your secret? And the guy said, don't eat junk and eat much less. And so I think, yes, that's the start point. I am not a dietitian. I can't give dietetic advice, but I will suggest that if you're on a quest for higher consciousness, something in your diet will change. Again, in the Bible, you can learn that because what's called fasting is often the prelude to a contact experience.
Truth. Yes.
So Daniel, Hebrew prince, changes his diet for 10 weeks. And at the end of 10 weeks, he has a close encounter. Moses changes his diet for 6 weeks and has a close encounter. That's part of a much wider pattern. So we think of fasting as not eating anything. Well, it isn't. You read those stories from the Bible, for instance, and you realize what it is as an altered diet, a pared back diet, a lighter diet. And yes, it might not have a lot of meat in it.
Yes.
I like meat, but I will tell you, I'm eating far less meat now than I was 3 years ago, because I feel better for it, and I feel more focused, and I believe there's a connection between thinking clearly and having a clean, sound diet.
Yes, thank you for that. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you. I can't, we're over time, and I just don't even want it to end. So amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, gosh, we need to have you come back again. There's so much more to talk about later.
Please.
I'm more than happy to. I always enjoy my conversations with you guys, and I love the connections we make, because I found when I got into Paleo Contact, it connects with every topic under the sun. You really do end up talking and thinking about everything the moment you've taken that particular red pill.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Quick question. Are you doing any, I know you're so busy. Are you doing any coaching or counseling or your talks with people? I'm just asking based on some of the conversation I saw in the chat.
Yes, I do coaching through my website, which is paulanthonywallace.com, Anthony with an H, Wallace, WALLIS.com. If you go to paulanthonywallace.com, at the top, you'll see coaching with Paul. And I do one-on-one sessions. I do it through Skype or Google Meets or through Signal. And I am enriched by those conversations myself. Very often I'm contacted by people who are sort of having to reframe their whole world because of something they've discovered or something that's happened. And I'm there just to walk them through that reframing process.
Yes. Yes. Thank
May
goodness.
I just ask you another quick question towards the end here. Are you also a contactee?
Yes, I talk about this in The Scars of Eden. It's one of the sort of central threads in that book, and I talk a bit more about it in Echoes of Eden. I, like a lot of experiences, I don't have a dramatic experience to share. I can say I've had a number of experiences I can't explain, and I can remember the first few moments of what I believe was an encounter, but I don't have a story like a Whitley Strieber story to tell. But enough other stuff has happened, not only anomalous experiences, but the experience of learning and discovery and writing that I look back on and think there's another layer to that. And I can begin joining dots and realize that just like everyone listening, we all have an invisible team around us of helpers.
Yeah.
And just like the writer of 1 John 4, I might even be a little bit agnostic as to who or what exactly they are. It doesn't matter as long as you keep your sovereignty, keep your autonomy, weigh up everything you think you're seeing and hearing, think for yourself. If you do that, says the writer of 1 John, you're on a good wicket and you'll get some good information. And as I look back on the processes I've been in the last few years, I can see that's really how it's played out.
And I want to tell the listeners to go to the website, say the website again, and then go there and look at the books and see what the subjects are in them. And then tell us just a little bit about your new book coming out too in maybe 2 or 3 or 4 weeks or so.
Sure. paulanthonywallace.com is the website. You can go to The Fifth Kind TV on YouTube and the Paul Wallace channel on YouTube. I'm always there in the comments having conversations with people. Echoes of Eden should be available for pre-order in the next month or so. And the tagline is, what secrets were buried with our ancestors' memories of ET contact? And the secrets have to do with really our last few questions about human consciousness and human potential and how to engage with the fullness of that.
Wow.
Amazing. Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So good.
Thanks for having me on again. I always enjoy my conversations with you guys.
Yeah.
We always go such interesting places.
Yes, we do.
Yeah,
Augie, you want to take us? Do you want to take us out? I don't want it to end, but
yeah, well, we're probably gonna have to, but we will have Paul to come back and visit again, and probably soon, especially after you get the new book out, because then, oh yes, there's stuff to talk about in there.
That'd be great.
And then we will be back next week, and until then, be good to each other.